I hit the ground before I even realized my crutches were gone. 1 second, I was trying to steady myself. The next, I was staring at 2 deep tracks in the mud where my only support had landed. Pain shot through my repaired hip as I caught myself with both hands, and all I could hear was my son-in-law, Mason Hayes, laughing. When I looked up, hoping someone would help me, my daughter, Claire Hayes, was standing right beside him, smiling as though nothing about this was cruel. I remember thinking there had to be some mistake. This was my own family. These were the people I'd sacrificed for, protected, and trusted more than anyone else. Then Mason looked down at me and said, "If you want them so badly, go get them yourself, old man." I saw people nearby freeze, but nobody stepped in. And as I struggled to my feet on one shaking leg, I noticed something that changed everything. It wasn't in the mud. It wasn't in Mason's face. It was the look that flashed across Claire's eyes for just a second, the kind of look people wear when they're terrified a secret is about to come out. "Welcome, and thank you for spending a little of your time with me today. If stories about family, respect, and the consequences of difficult choices speak to you, you're in the right place. Now, let me tell you how that ordinary afternoon changed my life forever. Less than 3 months before that afternoon, I couldn't even stand without someone helping me. A wet stretch of concrete outside a grocery store had sent me crashing onto my left side, leaving me with a fractured hip and a long recovery that tested every bit of patience I had. My orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Ethan Caldwell, kept reminding me that healing wasn't a race. But that's easy to say when you're not the one learning how to trust your own legs again. At 66, every step with those crutches felt like a small victory I had to earn. I hated depending on them, but I hated depending on other people even more. Before the accident, I had spent 38 years inspecting bridges across Colorado. My work wasn't the kind that earned headlines, but thousands of people crossed those bridges every day without thinking twice because my crew and I had done our jobs well. I believed in responsibility, showing up on time, and keeping my word. Those same values followed me home. After my wife passed away years earlier, I poured everything I had into raising my daughter, Claire Whitmore Hayes. I missed promotions, worked overtime, skipped vacations, and sacrificed more than she ever knew because I wanted her to have opportunities I never did. Watching her build a family of her own had always been my greatest source of pride. Retirement wasn't exactly what I'd imagined, but I never complained. I kept busy helping neighbors with small repairs, volunteering at community projects whenever my health allowed, and spending as much time as I could with my grandchildren, Owen and Sadie. They never cared how slowly I walked or whether I leaned on crutches. To them, I was simply Grandpa. That alone made the difficult days easier. Whenever Claire invited me over, I rarely said no. I honestly believed those afternoons meant as much to her as they did to me. The invitation to that Saturday barbecue sounded no different from dozens before it. Claire said the kids had been asking about me, and Mason Hayes, my son-in-law, had just finished some landscaping in the backyard that he wanted everyone to see. I noticed Mason had become shorter with me since my surgery, but I brushed it aside as stress from work. Families go through seasons, I told myself. People get tired. They say things they don't mean. I had no reason to think that spending a few hours with my daughter's family would become the moment that changed how I looked at them forever. If anything, I walked toward that house, believing I was surrounded by people who would always help me stand, never imagining I'd soon discover who was waiting for me to fall. Lunch had just ended when Claire Whitmore Hayes smiled and said, "Dad, come see what Mason's been working on in the backyard." It sounded harmless. The kids ran ahead, excited to show me the small stone path and flower beds they'd helped plant. I pushed myself up carefully, settled my weight onto my crutches, and followed at my own pace. The grass was still damp from the morning sprinklers, but I wasn't worried. I'd been through weeks of physical therapy. I knew my limits, and I wasn't about to let a little uneven ground keep me from spending time with my family. As we reached the edge of the yard, Mason Hayes stopped walking and turned to look at me. There was an impatient smile on his face that I'd seen before, but never paid much attention to. "You know," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "those crutches are becoming more of a habit than a necessity." I chuckled awkwardly and told him my doctor might disagree. Instead of laughing with me, he stepped closer, looked down at the crutches supporting my weight, and shook his head. "Sometimes people don't recover because everyone keeps treating them like they're fragile." Before I could answer, Mason grabbed both crutches with one quick motion. For a split second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then he yanked them completely out from under me. My balance disappeared instantly. I stumbled, barely catching myself on one leg before dropping hard onto my hands. Pain shot through my hip, and the world seemed to stop moving. Without a word of hesitation, Mason walked a few feet away and tossed both crutches into a patch of thick, muddy ground beside the flower beds. I looked up, expecting anyone to tell him he'd gone too far. Instead, I heard my daughter laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. She covered her mouth for a second and said, "Maybe this is exactly what Dad needs. He's stronger than he thinks." Mason folded his arms and looked down at me with a grin. "Get out and walk, old man," he said. "You won't need those things if you stop acting like you're helpless." Around us, neighbors walking past the fence slowed down to watch. My grandson, Owen Hayes, stood frozen with the football still tucked under his arm. My granddaughter, Sadie Hayes, stared at me in complete silence. In that moment, lying in the damp grass with my crutches sinking deeper into the mud, I realized the pain in my hip wasn't the worst thing I'd be carrying home that day. For a few seconds, nobody moved. I could hear birds in the trees, children playing somewhere down the street, and the faint splash of a sprinkler from a neighboring yard. Everything else had gone painfully quiet. I pushed myself upright with trembling hands, keeping almost all my weight on my good leg. Every instinct told me to crawl over and grab my crutches, but they were lying several feet away, half buried in thick mud. I wasn't just fighting the pain in my hip anymore. I was fighting the humiliation of knowing everyone watching had just seen my own family treat me like I didn't deserve basic respect. My grandson, Owen Hayes, finally broke the silence. "Mom, Grandpa's hurt," he said, taking a step toward me. Before he could get any closer, Mason Hayes held out an arm and stopped him. "He'll be fine," Mason replied casually. "He's got to learn he can't depend on those sticks forever." Owen looked confused, then looked at me. I forced a small smile and nodded. Not because I agreed with Mason, but because I didn't want my grandson remembering his grandfather as the old man who cried in the backyard. Across the lawn, my granddaughter, Sadie Hayes, stood clutching the drawing she'd made for me earlier. She wasn't smiling anymore. I slowly made my way toward the muddy flower bed, each hop sending another sharp stab through my hip. By the time I reached my crutches, both sleeves were soaked with dirt and grass stains. I bent down carefully, picked them up, and wiped the mud away with my hand. No one offered to help. Not Mason, not Claire. They simply watched as if I'd been taught some valuable lesson. That hurt far more than the fall itself. I realized then that what had happened wasn't an impulsive joke. Mason had expected everyone to laugh, and Claire had chosen his side without a second thought. As I steadied myself again, I quietly looked around the yard. A woman walking her dog on the sidewalk had stopped and was staring through the open gate with obvious disbelief. An older couple across the street had paused while loading groceries into their car. They hadn't heard every word, but they'd seen enough. Mason noticed them too. His confident smile faded for the briefest moment before he casually closed the gate, shutting out the witnesses. It was a tiny reaction, but I didn't miss it. For the first time that afternoon, I had the unmistakable feeling that Mason wasn't worried about what he'd done. He was worried about who had seen him do it. I didn't say another word. I brushed the mud from my crutches, thanked Owen for worrying about me, and told everyone I was feeling tired. Claire gave me a quick hug before I left. but it felt more like obligation than concern. Mason didn't apologize. He simply waved and said, "Drive safe, Arthur." As I pulled away from the house, I kept replaying the afternoon in my mind. The pain in my hip would eventually heal again. What I couldn't understand was how my own daughter had watched the whole thing happen without once telling her husband to stop. The next morning, I woke up sore enough that I almost canceled my physical therapy appointment. My therapist, Brooke Sinclair, noticed the fresh bruises on my hands before I even sat down. She asked what had happened, and for a moment I considered making up a story. Instead, I told her the truth. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, she looked me straight in the eye and quietly said, "Arthur, that's not someone trying to motivate you. That's someone deliberately putting you in danger." Hearing those words from a complete outsider hit harder than the fall itself. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that maybe yesterday hadn't been a joke gone too far. Maybe it had been exactly what it looked like. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my neighbor, Evelyn Mercer, who lived only a few houses away from Claire. She hesitated before speaking. "Arthur," she said gently, "I wasn't sure whether I should call, but I think you deserve to know something." She explained that after I drove away, she'd been watering her front flowers when she overheard Mason talking to another neighbor near the sidewalk. According to Evelyn, Mason laughed and said, "Maybe now he'll finally realize he's too old to keep living by himself. Someone's going to have to make that decision for him sooner or later." Evelyn admitted she couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she was certain of those words because they shocked her enough to stop what she was doing. I thanked Evelyn, but after we hung up, I sat in complete silence. Suddenly, every sarcastic comment Mason had made over the past few months took on a different meaning. The jokes about my age, the constant criticism of my recovery, the impatience every time I mentioned my own house, none of it felt random anymore. It felt deliberate, and one question refused to leave my mind. If humiliating me in front of my own grandchildren wasn't the real goal, then what exactly was Mason Hayes trying to make me give up? For the next several days, I couldn't stop thinking about what Evelyn Mercer had told me. If Mason Hayes wanted me out of my own house, the obvious question was, why? I wasn't wealthy by Colorado standards, but I'd spent nearly 4 decades paying off my mortgage. The house was mine, free and clear. It sat on a quiet corner lot that had steadily increased in value over the years. I'd always assumed it would simply stay in the family someday. Until now, I'd never considered that someone might be trying to rush that day along. The answer came from a place I wasn't expecting. My estate attorney, Nathaniel Pierce, called to remind me that it had been almost 8 years since I'd updated my will. We had scheduled the appointment months earlier, long before my accident, and I'd completely forgotten about it. During our meeting, he asked a simple question every attorney asks. "Has anything changed in your family that might affect your wishes?" I started to say no, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I found myself telling him everything that had happened at Claire's house. Nathaniel didn't interrupt until I finished. Then he leaned back in his chair and asked something that caught me off guard. "Arthur, has anyone in your family recently asked unusual questions about your property, your savings, or what would happen if you could no longer live independently?" I sat there for a moment before memories started falling into place. Mason had recently asked whether maintaining my house was becoming too much work. A few weeks later, Claire casually suggested that maybe I'd be happier in a retirement community where people could keep an eye on me. At the time, I'd thought they were simply concerned about my recovery. Looking back now, every conversation suddenly sounded rehearsed. I walked out of Nathaniel's office with a feeling I couldn't shake. The backyard humiliation wasn't the real story. It had only been one move in a much larger game. Someone wanted me to start believing I was too old, too weak, and too dependent to keep living on my own. If I accepted that lie, giving up my home would eventually feel like my own decision instead of theirs. But one thing still didn't make sense. Claire had always known the man who raised her would never surrender without a reason. So why was she helping Mason convince me that my life was already over? That night, I barely slept. Nathaniel Pierce's questions kept replaying in my head, mixing with the memory of my crutches sinking into the mud. For the first time in my life, I locked every door before going to bed and walked through my house checking every window. It wasn't because I thought someone was trying to break in. It was because the place suddenly felt different. Every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture my late wife and I had picked together, every inch of that house represented a lifetime of work. The thought that someone might already be planning my life after I'd been pushed out of it made my stomach turn. 2 evenings later, Claire Whitmore Hayes called. Her voice was unusually cheerful. She apologized for how things got out of hand at the barbecue. But the apology felt rehearsed. Before I could respond, she quickly changed the subject. "Dad," she said, "Mason and I have been talking. Maybe it's time you considered selling the house. It's too much for one person, especially after your accident. There are some beautiful retirement communities nearby. You'd have people around you all the time." She spoke gently, almost lovingly, but every sentence sounded strangely familiar, almost identical to the concerns Nathaniel had warned me about. I asked her a simple question. "Claire, if I hadn't fallen and broken my hip, would we even be having this conversation?" There was a long silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she quietly said, "We're just thinking about what's best for you." I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation before my voice betrayed what I was feeling. It wasn't anger anymore. It was disappointment. The kind that settles deep inside your chest because it comes from someone you've loved unconditionally. After hanging up, I sat alone in my living room until the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Then I walked into my home office, unlocked the small fireproof safe tucked inside the closet, and pulled out every important document I owned: my property deed, financial records, insurance papers, and my current will. As I spread them across the desk, one realization became impossible to ignore. This had never been about helping me recover. It had never been about concern for my safety. Someone had already started planning my future without ever asking whether I intended to give up the life I'd spent decades building. And at that moment, I made a decision of my own. Before anyone else made another move, I was going to find out exactly how far this plan had already gone. Motthaved, Knoll. The following morning, I met my estate attorney, Nathaniel Pierce, again. This time, I wasn't there to talk about updating a will. I wanted answers. After listening carefully, Nathaniel folded his hands and said, "Arthur, if someone is trying to convince you that you're no longer capable of managing your own life, the smartest thing you can do is document everything from this point forward. Don't argue, don't accuse anyone. Let their own actions tell the story." That advice changed my approach completely. Instead of confronting Claire Whitmore Hayes or Mason Hayes, I became an observer. I wrote down every phone call, every unexpected comment, and every visit. Whenever Mason joked that I was slowing down or hinted that my house had become too much responsibility, I simply smiled and changed the subject. The more comfortable he became, the less careful he was. He had no idea I had stopped reacting because I had started paying attention. Less than a week later, Claire invited me to dinner again. The invitation surprised me. She sounded unusually warm, insisting the grandchildren missed me and wanted another family night. Part of me wanted to refuse, but another part needed to know whether the barbecue had truly been an isolated incident or the beginning of something much bigger. So I accepted. When I arrived, everyone acted as though nothing had happened. Mason even apologized for getting carried away with what he called a harmless joke. But his smile never reached his eyes, and neither the apology nor the atmosphere felt genuine. It felt rehearsed, almost as if they needed me relaxed before bringing up something else. Sure enough, after dinner, Mason casually placed a folder on the kitchen table. "Arthur," he said, leaning back in his chair, "Claire and I have been doing some research. We found a few retirement communities we think you'd really like. They're safe, maintenance-free, and honestly, probably a better fit than living alone." Claire quietly nodded beside him, without meeting my eyes. I looked at the folder but didn't open it. Instead, I looked at both of them and politely asked a single question. Why do you both seem so certain that I'm not going to stay in my own home? For the first time that evening, neither of them answered immediately. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent conversation that lasted only a second, but revealed more than any explanation could have. In that moment, I knew Nathaniel had been right. They weren't reacting to my accident anymore. They were following a plan. The only thing I still didn't know was how long that plan had been in motion or who else already knew about it. I didn't answer their question that night, and I never opened the folder. I thanked Claire Whitmore Hayes for dinner, wished my grandchildren good night, and drove home with it sitting untouched on the passenger seat. The entire ride, I kept thinking about that glance Mason Hayes and Claire had exchanged. It wasn't the look of two people offering help. It was the look of two people wondering whether the plan they'd spent months putting together was finally about to work. The next morning, I called Nathaniel Pierce and asked him to come to my house instead of meeting at his office. As soon as he arrived, I handed him the folder. Inside were glossy brochures for retirement communities, a market analysis estimating the value of my home, and a handwritten page listing the benefits of selling quickly before another injury made things more complicated. Nathaniel read every page without saying a word. Then he stopped at the final sheet and slowly slid it across the table toward me. At the bottom of the page was a note that wasn't meant for my eyes. Once the house sells, everything else becomes much easier. There were no signatures, but I recognized Mason's handwriting instantly. I'd seen it on birthday cards, Christmas gifts, and thank you notes for nearly 15 years. My chest tightened, not because of the sentence itself, but because of what it revealed. They weren't trying to solve a problem. They were trying to remove an obstacle, and somewhere along the way, I'd become that obstacle. Nathaniel looked at me calmly before closing the folder. "Arthur," he said, "you've spent weeks wondering whether you were overreacting. You're not anymore. From this moment on, every decision you make needs to protect your future, not their expectations." I nodded without saying a word. The sadness I'd been carrying since the barbecue was quietly disappearing, replaced by something far steadier: clarity. For the first time since Mason threw my crutches into the mud, I wasn't asking why they had done it. I already knew. The only question left was whether they were prepared for what would happen when they discovered I wasn't nearly as helpless or as unprepared as they'd convinced themselves I was. I didn't call Claire Whitmore Hayes, I didn't confront Mason Hayes, and I certainly didn't tell either of them what I'd found inside that folder. Instead, I did something they never expected. I updated every legal document I owned. With Nathaniel Pierce sitting beside me, I revised my will, assigned a durable power of attorney to someone outside the family, and placed my home into a revocable living trust with clear instructions that no beneficiary would receive the property until after my death, and only under conditions that reflected the values I'd spent a lifetime living by. If those conditions weren't met, the house would be sold, and the proceeds would go to charities supporting injured veterans and seniors recovering from physical disabilities. Nathaniel looked up after the last signature and quietly said, "No one will be able to pressure you into changing this later." About 2 weeks later, Claire invited me to another family dinner. This time, I accepted without hesitation. The conversation stayed pleasant until dessert, when Mason leaned back in his chair with that same confident smile I'd seen the day he threw my crutches into the mud. "So," he said casually, "have you given any more thought to selling the house?" I took a sip of coffee before answering. "Actually," I replied, "I've spent the last couple of weeks making sure my future is completely settled." The smile on Mason's face grew wider. Claire looked relieved. They both assumed I was finally about to give them the answer they'd been waiting to hear. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and placed a single sealed envelope on the table. "This is a copy of the only information you need to know," I said calmly. Mason opened it almost immediately. His expression changed before he'd even reached the second page. Claire leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The confidence disappeared from Mason's face, so quickly it was almost startling. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of sympathy for herself. They were the unmistakable realization that the decisions she'd made over the past few months had carried consequences she could no longer undo. I stood up carefully, leaning on the same crutches Mason had once thrown into the mud. Then I looked at both of them and said, "The day you laughed while I was lying on the ground, you convinced yourselves I was too weak to protect what I'd spent my life building. The truth is, you didn't lose this house because of a legal document. You lost it the moment you forgot how to treat family." I wished my grandchildren goodbye, walked to my truck at my own pace, and drove away without looking back. For the first time since my accident, I didn't feel wounded. I felt free. I haven't seen Mason Hayes since that evening. Claire Whitmore Hayes called several times during the weeks that followed, but I wasn't ready to answer. Some wounds don't heal because time passes. They heal because the truth finally settles in. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and fades. What I felt instead was acceptance. The hardest lesson wasn't discovering that my son-in-law had tried to push me out of my own life. It was accepting that my daughter had stood beside him while it happened. Life slowly became quiet again. I returned to physical therapy, and every week I relied a little less on my crutches. One afternoon, my therapist, Brooke Sinclair, smiled as I walked across the room without stopping once. "You're stronger than you think," she said. I smiled back because, for the first time, I knew she wasn't talking about my hip. Healing had never been just about learning to walk again. It was about learning that self-respect sometimes means walking away from the people who no longer respect you. The happiest surprise came a month later. My grandson, Owen Hayes, knocked on my front door with his mother waiting quietly in the driveway. He hugged me before saying a single word. Then he looked up and asked, "Grandpa, can we still build that birdhouse you promised me?" I looked over his shoulder. Claire didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stood there with tears in her eyes, watching. I didn't know whether she had finally recognized everything she'd allowed to happen, or whether she had simply realized what it had cost her. Either way, that conversation would have to wait for another day. Children shouldn't have to carry the weight of their parents' mistakes. As Owen and I worked in the garage that afternoon, I caught myself looking at the same pair of crutches leaning quietly against the wall. The mud had long since been washed away, but I never threw them out. They remind me that weakness isn't needing help after you've been hurt. Real weakness is believing another person's dignity has less value because they're older, slower, or healing. Mason thought throwing my crutches into the mud had taken away my independence. In the end, all it really did was reveal who had already lost theirs. And if there's one thing I've learned after 66 years, it's this. The people who try hardest to make you feel small usually do it because they're afraid of standing beside someone whose character is bigger than theirs.